I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share with you the findings of a large study of kinship care, informal kinship care, that we conducted in the UK. Now, the first phase was a reanalysis of census data, that's to say whole population data. And we have analysed the 2001 and the 2011 census data. So I'll be talking about that more recent date. Now, in 2011, we found that in the UK, about 180,000 children were living with relatives without a parent present in the household. And if we just look at England, that means 1 in 74 children was in relative kinship care. We can't find out how many friend carers there were because you can't extract that from census data. We know that there were only 5% of children who were in kinship foster care, i.e. they were in care. And that means that 95% of children being brought up by relatives in the UK are not in care at all. Now, we have this strange thing called private law orders, and so some of them are on those orders, although we don't have figures for that, and they can get some help, but it's discretionary. However, as you can see, the great majority of kinship care is informal, where no support, financial or otherwise, is provided. Now, what the census showed was that most children being brought up by relatives were living in families whose characteristics associated with an increased risk of poverty. Single female carers, dependent on benefits in workless households, and a higher prevalence of limiting long-term illness, as well as an overrepresentation of ethnic minorities. Also, 2 in 3 children being brought up by relatives were living in households located in the 40% of poorest areas in England, and more than 3/4 of the children were living in a deprived household in relation to the indicators of household deprivation used in the census, which relate to employment, education, housing, and health. Other things from the census show that half the children were brought up by grandparents, but as many as 23% were being brought up by a sibling. We never get that kind of number of siblings in our research studies, but it's important to remember that they are out there doing that important work. And the remainder were being brought up by other relatives, such as aunts, uncles, and cousins. High proportions of grandparents, perhaps not surprisingly, reported limiting long-term illness or disability. And this was also true of the children, so that the children were nearly twice as likely to have a long-term health problem or disability as compared with children growing up with at least one parent. So as you can see, when we look at the whole population of children being brought up by relatives, they are disproportionately living in poverty, disproportionately living in deprived areas with high levels of health difficulties relating both to the carers and the children. In the second phase of this study, we interviewed 80 informal kinship carers and 80 children who they looked after. And this was to find out children's views of being brought up in informal kinship care, to investigate how well the carers manage the children they're looking after, the strain they experience and any supports they receive or need. And we were able to assess the well-being of the children on a range of dimensions. Basically, we had to recruit using a big variety of ways in order to find informal kinship carers. We used a children's illustrator who worked up a workbook for children which had all the measures and various other things, and you'll see little examples of that in what I'm going to say. And we were able to use standardized measures, and the children in the study were aged from 8 to 18. 78% of the children were white, and the children had lived with their carers for between 11 months and 9 years. In this more typical research sample, grandparents were 61% of the sample, aunts and uncles 19%, a group of others and friends, and then a very small group of siblings. And the carers were aged between 22 and 79. and half were lone carers, and most were living in poverty. Now, Children's Statutory Services in the UK had taken the view that none of these children had been formally placed by them. Actually, they had sometimes, if not quite often, been involved at the outset, but as long as they weren't there when the children actually went to the kinship family, they were able to say that it was nothing to do with them, and they would, if need be, pressure the kinship carers to take out these private law orders, sometimes with a threat that otherwise the children would be taken into care. And a big group, 72% of these carers, did get a private law order, but only 30% of those with those private law orders got any kind of financial allowance. And then the other 28% of carers had no order, so they weren't entitled to any financial help or social work support. In these families in the study, poverty was prevalent. Just over a third had incomes of less than £200 a week, which is equivalent to 17,900 Australian dollars. But the majority of carers didn't have a history of long-term unemployment. What had happened was that they had been thrust into poverty because in order to take the children, they'd often given up jobs, gone part-time, or simply had to manage the children on a pension, which was designed to only just about give them enough money on their own. The children's age at the start of these arrangements is quite widely spread. As you can see, a third went there under the age of 3 and 25% 12 years or over. And that means we should be able to pick up on a range of the kind of issues that occur depending when children arrive there, because obviously it's very different bringing up a very small child where you have spent most of the time with the relatives to taking a child who's spent quite a long time with their parents. Now, the reason the children were in kinship care was in 2/3 of cases that the parents were misusing alcohol or drugs. 1 in 3 had experienced the death of a parent, and the carers thought that nearly all of them had been maltreated, 88%, before they'd stepped in to care for them. And a particular phenomenon we picked up on was that 1/3 of the parents had very actively rejected or abandoned their children. For example, a couple of the parents had simply taken a child to the grandparents and left them on the doorstep. Children's understanding of why they were there was very varied. So one 15-year-old, for example, said, "My mum is dead and my father hates me." And a 16-year-old, "My father beat me up when I was 16 weeks old and I had a fractured skull and a broken collarbone and my mum was on heroin." And a 15-year-old, "I think it was because my mum didn't want me." But others, as we'll see, didn't know why they were there. So this is a piece of help that I think kinship carers need to help them think about how they do talk to children about the reasons that they're bringing them up. Most of the children had contact with the extended family, and that, of course, is one of the benefits of kinship care. Just over half had contact with their mothers and just under half with their fathers. But as we know from so many other research studies, carers often had to manage very difficult contact situations, including dealing with intimidating, unreliable, or inconsistent parents. And some of these parents were still dependent on the kinship carer for financial or emotional support, especially parents with alcohol or drugs misuse difficulties. For example, parents might turn up at any time of the day or night to sort of demand some kind of help or money, and very often they would more or less disregard or ignore the child. Many of these children valued contact with their parents but were aware of their limitations. One 16-year-old said, "I'm fine with my mum. She's more like a friend." Well, not a friend, not as good as a friend, just someone my age. But other children were hostile to parents who let them down. An 8-year-old boy said, "My mum gets drunk and I don't like that. I hate her because we always get into fights." And one of the things that sometimes these children had to deal with was coming to terms with exposure to repeated parental indifference or rejection. One 12-year-old girl explained it like this. She said, "I used to cry when my mum went because I was like young and I didn't understand. But now we saw her in Greentown yesterday and well, I was like, 'Oh, mum, hello.' And then she had to go almost straight away. And I was like, bye, Mum. And a 10-year-old said very poignantly, it's hard because I see my mum picking up my brother and half-sister from school, and I think, why couldn't that be me? And what 1 in 5 of the carers thought that the quality of their relationship with a child was affected by the child's relationship with or feelings about a parent. Now, if we look at the children's well-being, we found that most had normal development, were securely attached to their carers, had a sense of permanence, were protected from risks and encouraged. And to break that down a bit more, most of these children felt they could stay with their kinship carers as long as they wanted. And that's, of course, much rarer for children in ordinary care. And children's total scores for their security of attachment measure to the main carer were similar to those in the general population, which is a very good finding. On a measure of children's self-esteem, most of the children had scores in the high or average range, but 16% had very low scores, indicating they had serious doubts about their own self-worth. But again, those scores are similar to those in the general population. And on a self-rated depression scale, 11% of the children scored as being depressed. Now, that is higher for children than for children in the general population, where it's 4%, but quite a bit lower than for children in care generally. On the well-known strengths and difficulties questionnaire, a third of these children had scores in the abnormal range for emotional and behavioural difficulties. So we would expect those children to present considerable challenges to their carers. A third of children in the abnormal range on the SDQ is higher than for the general population, where it's about 10%, but lower than for children in care, where a range of scores have been found, but 45% or more is not unusual. There was one subscore, which was the emotional symptoms scale, where quite a few kinship children scored as being in the abnormal range, 39%. And these were children who said that they were often unhappy, had many fears, were nervous in new situations, and worried a lot. And we'll come back to the question of worrying in a minute. Most of the children saw school as good or okay, and of the children who'd taken the 16-year-old GCSE exams, 43% had gained the standard 5 A star to C grades, which compared with 58% in the general population and far fewer, 13% of children in care. And encouragingly, many of them had positive aspirations and planned to get further education or training in the future. There was, as you can see, a group of children who were not doing so well, and their characteristics were that they were often insecurely attached to the carer. They had a history of previous moves, something that predicts poorer outcomes for all children, whether in kinship care or in care generally. They had small networks of family and friends and very poor contact with parents. A few other issues are worth bringing out. One is that although we sometimes think that children in kinship care don't suffer the stigma of children in care, over a third of these children did report hurtful remarks from others about the fact they were living with kinship carers, and 5 of them were bullied. So a 17-year-old boy said, people that I've just met have been quite insensitive and be like, it's a bit weird you don't live with your parents. Do they hate you? And interestingly, most of the children and young people only told a few close friends about why they were in kinship care, although nearly a quarter hadn't told friends about this. So they guard that information pretty closely. A fifth of the children didn't know why they were living with kin or not with their parents, and had other unanswered questions about the past. So a 13-year-old boy said, I'd like to know just why I moved, because I thought my mum was healthy and I was only little, so I didn't really understand much. And an 18-year-old girl, the thing is, I don't know how it happened. I just know my mum couldn't cope. And a 9-year-old said, I don't know why I'm not living with my parents. So as we said before, this is clearly something that does need to be addressed so that children have explanations about why they are being brought up with kin, not with parents, just as we would expect to do that piece of work with children in care generally. That's a page from the activity book, and we asked children what sort of things they worried about and gave them a card to write things down on and put them in the envelope on the worry tree. And the things that came out were typically dying, because I know a lot of people who have. My mum and how long she's going to live. If something would happen to my nan, I don't want to lose her like I lost my mum. If my nan dies, what will happen to me? So although children worried about what would happen to them if their kinship carer died, they usually hadn't felt able to raise this with them. And that could be quite a worrying issue for children who don't have any idea who might look after them if their carer could no longer do so. Again, another piece of work to advise carers to have had those conversations with children. However, overall, as you can see, the children were doing well. Most of them felt they belonged in their kinship family. They were confident they would be there long term. Most were securely attached to their primary carer, and their attachment and self-esteem levels were similar to those in an ordinary population of school children. Although a third had behavioural and emotional problems and 11% were depressed, that is fewer than usually found for children in care. So now if we look at the kinship carers, we get a very, very different picture, because most of them had significant difficulties, unlike the children. They often were dealing with issues of grief and bereavement, had a sense of hopelessness about the situation, were in physical pain and had limited social networks. And as we've seen, many were in poverty, generally as a consequence of taking on the children. So in this sample, very few of the carers reached the minimum socially acceptable standard of living in the UK, and single carers with more than one child were especially poor. And as we know, poverty affects children's life chances, including their health, cognitive development, and educational outcomes. So to break that down a bit more, what it showed was that 77% of the carers couldn't afford a holiday, compared with 26% in the population. Over a quarter couldn't afford heating when it was needed, compared to 9% of the population. And half of them worried about money almost all the time. So one sibling who was bringing up a 16-year-old brother said, "I worry about money every day. There's not been a week since my mum died that I've not worried about money. We're just surviving. That's the only way I can describe it. The fridge is always empty." And a young aunt who was bringing up her 17-year-old niece, who'd left a really good job in another town, moved in with her niece, said this: "I'm trying to work out how I'm going to get the boiler fixed, and if we're going to make it through the winter with heating. I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. I have about 2 hours sleep a night because I worry about money." But the carers prioritised the children's needs over their own, and we felt to an extent they were able to shield them from the worst effects of these hardships. The carers also talked about the gains they had from bringing up the children, the companionship the children gave them, and that it could give them a sense of purpose. One grandmother bringing up a 12-year-old said, "I've got somebody to love who loves me as well. I've got somebody who depends on me, who I depend on as well. And honestly, everything is positive about looking after her." We found that 73% of this sample of the carers had long-standing health conditions or disabilities, and the lives of as many as 37% were restricted by pain. And that actually affected all types of carers except the young sibling carers. I mean, the sibling carers, because of course they were much younger than the others. And a rather alarming 67% of the carers were clinically depressed on the measure we used, but only 27% had been diagnosed with depression. Of course, one of the issues that quite a lot of the carers were facing was dealing with difficult behaviour. So one grandmother bringing up a 12-year-old said, "She's draining all the energy out of me. She's draining everything I've got. Her disruptive behaviour goes on for hours. I'm just run down with all the carry-on. And I've been taking really bad headaches, but I think that's stress because I'm not sleeping." And carers struggled to deal with the sort of disturbed behaviours that many of these children were showing. And when this was combined with other stressors, the strain could be extraordinarily difficult. One grandmother bringing up a 14-year-old girl said, "Nothing seems simple anymore. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I do feel close to despair and I dream of packing my bags and just going." Another issue that 60% of the carers were dealing with was difficulties with contact. A step-grand mother told us that there had been 79 contacts arranged with the mother, of which she only appeared for 11 of them, and in 5 of that 11 she was late. So of course that would have a huge impact on those children. And then a grandmother talked about how things were for her, and she said about the 16-year-old's mother, her mum stirs things up against us. For instance, Phoebe said to me only yesterday, "No wonder mum can't stand you. You never ever stop going on." I can well imagine that's what mum's been saying. And we know that some of the parents actively undermine these placements and try to, as it were, take over and challenge the things that the carers are doing. So contact has many aspects that can be pretty difficult. Quite a lot of children were dealing with unresolved grief, for example, if the child's parent had died. Most of them had lost their life plans. Grandparents, of course, going backwards in their life cycle with losing their freedom and retirement, and sibling carers and other young carers thrust forward into parenting, missing out on further education, job training, friendships and partnerships. And they were out of step with their age group, leading to a loss of friends. And for over half of them, caring for the child had caused a lot of difficulty in their partner relationships, with 23% of couples separating as a result. I think that's a rather underreported finding from the research. All these things could lead to a sense of hopelessness. One aunt said, "I've given up my life for this, my life has gone." And a grandmother said, "The biggest thing is losing your freedom, because it's a form of imprisonment. You're never going to find a partner. You're not going to make new friends because you've got a child. Old friends won't fit in around what time I have free." We pulled out 3 groups of kinship carers who we thought needed particular attention. One was these young kinship carers, which I think you've already looked at in another session, siblings and young aunts principally. And as I've said before, 23% of kinship carers in the UK are sibling carers. They were much more likely than others to be in poverty, to be in overcrowded situations, and of course, generally had no previous experience of parenting, and all of them were depressed. So we really need to do what we can to involve them in of course, in getting help and in any other forms of support that they would welcome. A second group is kinship carers who are in poor health and dependent on the help of the child. Some of these children were really happy to take on a caring role, but others saw their lives as restricted and envied friends who had more varied sociable lives, especially if they were living in quite isolated areas. And then this third group we've touched on, the kinship carers who supported 2 generations. So the child, but also often the child's parents, especially those with alcohol or drugs problems. They very often would very much benefit from more support and perhaps advice on how to manage these very difficult situations. Now, there is a general idea out there, especially from children's services, that you don't need to put more support in because kinship carers have wide circles of extended family who will be there for them. But we didn't find that was the case in this study. We found that most of the kinship carers had only 2 or 3 people they could count on if they needed help. And in fact, most had more friends than family members they could rely on. And indeed, for 30% of carers, the kinship arrangement had caused tensions in the extended family, sometimes because other of their children were jealous of the attention to the child, and that meant less attention to their own children. Also, over a third of the carers had actually been the butt of critical remarks because they were kinship carers. And that's quite in contrast, obviously, to foster carers who are seen as really sort of benefactors and rather looked up to. Kinship carers, it seems, in some cases, are probably blamed for the difficulties of the children's parents. And they did often feel ashamed if the parent was known to be, for example, misusing alcohol or drugs, or in prison or on the street. Most of the carers had used only the most well-known services like after-school clubs and were unaware of the extent of semi-formal support which might have been available from voluntary organisations. So there's a big piece about getting that information out there. And GPs, that's to say family doctors, teachers and solicitors were their main sources of support. However, most of their interventions were quite brief, as you'd expect. I was quite surprised to find that as many as 71% of the carers had actually contacted children's services to ask for help, but the help was often refused, often without an assessment, and only 23% of them had actually got the help they'd asked for. And being refused help was an incredibly impactful experience to have, and it meant that kinship carers would have rarely returned to ask again. So one grandmother said, I asked to speak to somebody at Children's Services, and I said, I need some support. And they said no, because it was a private arrangement. The children have never been known to Children's Services. So no, we're not going to help you. And a young aunt said, I asked for counselling for me, but I got told I needed to get a job. The kids had attachment issues when I first moved up here, and I didn't feel comfortable leaving them because obviously, you know, they were frightened I was going to die as well. I thought Children's Services would be able to help me. And when I got told to get a job, it just kind of, oh, all right then, I'll just crack on, because that's what it made me feel like. So this was really an experience that was very, very difficult and off-putting, let's say. So what the kinship carers wanted, 90% wanted more help. And the issue most often mentioned, not surprisingly, was financial help. One said what would have made a difference would have been to have been classed as a foster care and be given an allowance, not for me to be scrimping and scraping every week for the kids. And another said others wanted some emotional support. One said just people listening. They wanted help with parental contact when it became difficult, and information and advice about the services for the children that were available, not having to fight to get help. And they often wanted help in managing the young person's behaviour. So in conclusion, there needs to be awareness that informal kinship care is widespread and that these carers disproportionately live in poverty. Most of the children in informal kinship care, all the research shows, have experienced similar adversities to children in care. So it's hard to see the justice in the fact that they're treated so differently from them. In spite of all this, these children have good outcomes, and their outcomes are better than for children in care, though not as good as for children in the general population. And a subsequent study we've done, which I've referenced here, takes that on into shows their outcomes as young adults, which makes this point. They do better than for children in care, but not as good as for children in the general population, partly because, of course, of the adversities they experienced when they were still with their parents. But reasonable as these outcomes are, their carers are often struggling. And whether kinship carers are supported and receive a financial allowance is a lottery in the UK. So whole system change is needed to provide a national allowance for all kinship carers. There needs to be much more awareness by services generally of the disadvantages faced by these children, and the children should have priority access to help in schools and child and adolescent mental health services, as do our children in care. And kinship carers do need support on a range of things, including contact when it becomes difficult and early independent legal advice, so that they would actually have information about legal orders and financial allowances before they decide what they're going to do and which kind of order they're going to accept. And I think it's fair to say that services could mitigate the strain on kinship carers and improve children's life chances. Voluntary organisations in the UK play a vital role, and their services need to be promoted widely, and especially to try and encompass all kinds of kinship carers. They reach far more grandparents than they reach aunts, uncles, siblings, and so on. And services that are needed to reduce strain on kinship carers and assist isolated children include short break care, buddying systems for new carers, especially young kinship carers, support groups for all kinds of kinship carers, especially again trying to include aunts, uncles and sibling carers. And clearly some could be online, because during the pandemic, we've had lots of these groups really thriving online, and that might be a way to reach out to the groups who are underrepresented. And there's also been a nice piece of research by the organisation called Kinship showing really big benefits in terms of confidence in parenting and so on for those who attend support groups. Child sitting services can be useful, volunteers to take children out regularly, children's activities and holiday programmes. And this grandmother, I think, spoke for many when she said there must be thousands of people in the same position as me. And I think it's down to finance, that successive governments have never, ever wanted to acknowledge this underclass of caring that's going on. I can't tell you how hard it's been, and the eternal phrase, but this is a private arrangement. If you're interested, the report can be obtained from the web, as can the various census analyses. Thank you very much.